Hello, it's good to be with you again for our adult Sunday school lesson, and we are picking up pretty close to where we left off last week, or from last week, here in 2 Kings chapters 4 and 5. We will be backing up just a little bit to discuss the context of chapter 3, as it does a little bit more to kind of introduce us to the ministry of Elisha, independent of Elijah, as the frame from the author's perspective is shifting from Elijah's ministry now solely to that of Elisha, and the way that his ministry is going to be laid out is resoundingly different from Elijah. Elijah shows up on the scene. He challenges a king. He states that rain and dew will be withheld from the land until he gives word for it to happen, and then just disappears. Imposes exile upon himself, which of course is meant to illustrate that the land, as goes the kingdom of Israel and the people who are living under the rule of Ahab, are also in some measure of exile. All that to say that he will then cross over the River Jordan and spend some time on the east side. From there, he will go all the way across Israel and then to the western side, where the kingdom of Phoenicia, cities of Tyre and Sidon are. And then after that, he will come back into the land. And then there's that showdown with the prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel, with Ahab witnessing it. And then after that, where we were talking about last week with respect to how Elijah, when he went down to Jezreel with the intent or hope that perhaps things might change and the people's hearts were truly being revived and turning to the Lord, that if anything, it turned into an outright, dare I say, witch hunt. But nonetheless, he became public enemy number one in Jezebel's eyes. And then he left from there and went down to Mount Horeb or Sinai. So much of the time that he's had has not really been in the land, sparse moments. But when we look at the ministry of Elisha, much of that will be very different, because almost all of Elisha's ministry is going to be in the land, and the few sparse moments that he is outside the land, because we'll track him in places like Damascus or on the eastern side of the Jordan and the plains of Moab. But all of the miracles that he does is actually inside the land, whereas Elisha's, for the most part, were kind of mixed between both out and in. So because of the fact that the frame is shifting and we're looking at a new prophet with a ministry that is to the same people, but as it is actually unpacked for us, looks quite different than Elijah's did with respect to the way he's ministering to the people, albeit many of the miracles are very similar. And of course, it's a continuation of Elijah's ministry. In no way, shape, or form is Elisha doing anything different. He is, after all, carrying the mantle that Elijah left for him. It's important for us to understand the context of chapter 3 and how it sets us up for the events of chapters 4 and 5. So with that, I have a couple of sections actually that we're going to be reading in chapter 4, as you see, verses 18 through 21, 32 through 35, 42 through 44. Just in case you've never joined us before, these three little dots that you see highlighted in green is where the passage will transition from one section to the next. I'm not going to call them out. I'm just going to read them through as if they're one continuous passage. To give you a little bit of background before we actually jump into this passage, where we'll be picking up in verse 18 of chapter 4, Elisha has already granted a miraculous blessing to this particular woman from the area or province known as Shunem. So she is often referred to as a Shunammite, who had been childless up to this point. And as part of this blessing, in many ways, it mimics the gifting that God had granted to Sarah and Rebecca and Rachel. And of course, with those matriarchal women as part of Israel's history, anytime a woman is experiencing fruitlessness of the womb, certainly those women are part of the background that we should be thinking of with respect to biblical stories, right? All that to simply say, Elisha blesses her and she is granted this wonderful gift of having a child. And this is the very child that we pick up with here in verse 18. So the child grew and one day went out to his father and the harvesters. Suddenly he complained to his father, my head, my head. His father told his servant, carry him to his mother. So he picked him up and took him to his mother. The child sat on her lap until noon, and then he died. She went up and laid him on the bed of the man of God. And the man of God in reference here is Elisha. And so part of the reason why Elisha did this was because she granted him a blessing before Elisha did anything for her, because he had frequented by her house many times, not stopping off necessarily, but coming close enough. She knew who this man was and wanted to do something special for him as a blessing for the Lord's prophet, and that was to build an upper room or just a small bedroom chamber up on the outer wall, upper deck of her house, so that this man could have a place to stop and just rest himself on his journeys. And so, as part of this, Elisha, being the spokesman for the Lord, sought to bless her. So, anyway, that is the reason why there's a bed for the man of God in her house. All that to say, she shut him in and then left. When Elisha got to the house, he discovered the boy lying dead on his bed. So he went in, closed the door behind the two of them, and prayed to the Lord. Then he went up and lay on the boy. He put mouth to mouth, eye to eye, hand to hand. While he bent down over him, the boy's flesh became warm. Elisha got up, went into the house, and paced back and forth. Then he went up and bent down over him again. The boy sneezed 7 times and opened his eyes. I understand there's some strange things here. Why did Elisha go down inside the house to pace back and forth after warmth came back to this boy's dead flesh? Better yet, why do we have the mentioning of sneezing 7 times? I just want to put as a disclaimer, I have absolutely no idea. I have nothing in the way of giving an answer for why that might be. I'm sure that perhaps may have meant something to ancient audiences who would be reading these words and perhaps hearing of this miracle as passed around in oral form. And maybe information is out there that I just haven't come across yet. So please forgive me in not having that available to share with you, if just in case that was something that was scratching the curiosity center of your mind. As we move on, a man from Baal Shalishah came to the man of God with his sack full of 20 loaves of barley bread from the first bread of the harvest. Elisha said, "Give it to the people to eat." But Elisha's attendant asked, "What, am I to set this before 100 men? Give it to the people to eat," Elisha said, "for this is what the Lord says. They will eat and they will have some left over." So he set it before them, and as the Lord had promised, they ate and had some left over. So now 2 Kings 5, 1-3, and as you see here again, this point of transition to verses 10-16. Naaman, commander of the army for the king of Aram, was an important man to his master and highly regarded, because through him the Lord had given victory to Aram. There's something there that obviously needs to be unpacked a little bit with respect to the Lord granting victory to Israel's enemies, the circumstances behind that. We would understand it perhaps a bit better, recognizing that the Omrides, meaning Omri, his son Ahab, and now his son Joram or Jehoram, either name goes for that particular king, have been reigning over Israel, and of course have been idolatrous kings and have walked Israel off the cliff a little bit further into the territory of darkness that Jeroboam, son of Nebat, had started. And this, of course, is the Lord's means of punishing them as he did Israel back in the days of the judges. Either way, the man was a valiant warrior, but he had a skin disease. Your Bible may say leprosy, but commentators often agree in more of a consensus fashion that this is not actually leprosy in the sense of Hansen's disease, which is often what we would understand leprosy to be, in the sense that the extremities of the body start to experience paresthesia, meaning a complete lack of sensation of feeling. And then eventually it looks like the skin itself starts to turn into melted candle wax as it begins to die, and digits on the extremities perhaps even become a little bit on the zombified side and start to fall off the body, perhaps, and the body slowly starts to die from the inside out. The way this is described in Levitical texts doesn't really seem consistent with what Hansen's disease appears like. So this could be a myriad of different diseases that are considered leprosy, but of course affect the skin. Either way, just wanted to explain that to you if perhaps your Bible says leprosy while the CSB translates it skin disease. Aram had gone on raids and brought back from the land of Israel, a young girl who served Naaman's wife. She said to her mistress, "If only my master were with the prophet who is in Samaria," referring to Elisha, "he would cure him of his skin disease." Then Elisha sent him a messenger and said, "Go wash 7 times in the Jordan, and your skin will be restored, and you will be clean." But Naaman got angry and left, saying, "I was telling myself, he will surely come out and stand and call on the name of the Lord his God, and wave his hand over the place and cure the skin disease. Aren't Abana and Pharpar, the rivers of Damascus, better than all the waters of Israel? Couldn't I wash in them and be clean?" So he left, or turned and left in a rage. But his servants approached him and said to him, "My father, if the prophet had told you to do something great, would you not have done it? How much more should you do it when he only tells you to wash and be clean?" So Naaman went down and dipped himself in the Jordan 7 times. according to the command of the man of God. Then his skin was restored and became like the skin of a small boy, and he was clean. Then Naaman and his whole company went back to the man of God, stood before him, and declared, I know there's no God in the whole world except in Israel. Therefore, please accept a gift from your servant. But Elisha said, As the Lord lives, in whose presence I stand, I will not accept it. Naaman urged him to accept it, but he refused. If you'll join me now for a moment of prayer. Jesus, our King, as always, Lord, we are grateful that you give us the chance to meet together in this place and experience your word in this particular way with the advantage of technology that we have, albeit it may not be the same as being able to openly converse over it in real time and space, in person with each other. But thank you, Lord, for the chance for those who were just not able to quite make it, or perhaps are not even a part of Kingsville or necessarily a part of the United States as a citizen. I have no idea where this information goes once it's posted on the internet. And I'm grateful for anyone out there, Lord, who is taking the time to listen to it, and however they got connected to it. I just praise you that though there are evil uses of technology out there in the hands of those who only mean to twist it for nefarious reasons and purposes, that in some ways, while we are not concerned with necessarily redeeming the things of this world, as goes technology, yet it can be harnessed also for good things to bring glory to your name. And I intend to do that tonight, Lord. I pray that you would help me to be faithful in representing the truth of your word, and to do so in a way that inspires your people, that challenges us as goes our faith and our understanding of how we are supposed to follow you as disciples. May we break away from any sense of familiarity with respect to this story, if it would only hamper us and keep us from seeing new truth, fresh truth that's always been there, but for some reason has just been dormant and unavailable to us, but now perhaps in some way may be. We ask it, Lord, in your name, that you be glorified. Amen. So let's look at the miracles of Elisha, which, if you remember last week, we were talking about how if we understand the story of Elijah correctly, and there are many things, facets, layers to understand with respect to the story of Elijah. But I think one thing with respect to the way that the author is orchestrating the story and the particulars of the details as they are arranged in the text that we've looked at over the last week or so, then I think one thing we can very easily surmise and take away from it is that Elijah was coming on the scene as something of a new Moses. There are many things that I would take the opportunity to rehash here, but I'm not going to, because it's just going to take too much time to do that and will detract away from what we actually have to study and focus on here. So in case you're wondering, because you didn't get a chance to catch that lesson, or maybe you just don't remember, then I adjure you to go back and rewatch, or for the first time experience last week's lesson. So that way it will make better sense with respect to the context of this one. But the follow-on would be, if Elijah didn't just simply fade out of the picture and then another prophet just winsomely come in on the scene out of nowhere, like Elijah seemingly did, and other prophets that have been mentioned to us in the books of Kings. We briefly mentioned Micaiah last week. It's like, who's that guy? Where has he been this whole time? Or the actual man of God that was spoken of earlier in 1 Kings chapter 10 and 11, whenever, we do have a prophet named Adonijah, but then another guy from Judah, a man of God who goes and challenges Jeroboam, who has erected shrines and idols and various other things, and he captures him at Bethel and challenges him with giving him this sign act of the judgment that this king that will come from David's house someday, Josiah, will bring upon this very altar that, Jeroboam has erected. Rabbit trail to get us back to the main path here. But the point I make is just that if Elijah had just bowed out of the scene and his time as a prophet was over, and another prophet had come along with really no connection between the two of them, perhaps there could be an understanding of the sequencing, that Elijah being a new Moses figure, that this next person who's coming on the scene as a prophet would be perhaps a Joshua-like figure. But we don't have that. What we have is a very clear shaking of hands moment where, granted, it's a period that lasts for several years. It is even said of Elisha, when others are, I guess, kind of becoming a bit more familiar with who he is and introducing him to others, they look to him as the person who used to pour water on Elijah's hands. So while the sequence of events may seem rather brief, and that while Elijah called Elisha to follow him and anointed him in a way that made it clear and obvious to him he's supposed to be his replacement by dropping his mantle on him. And then a few chapters later, literally just a matter of verses in the literary space that we have, that it seems like Elijah is leaving, whereas Bart mentioned last week, certainly commentators put it in a span of years. And for a statement to be made that Elisha was noted to be the one who used to pour water on Elijah's hands, that kind of reputation would take years to garner, and that people would be used to seeing him in this kind of servant capacity in Elijah's shadow. But now he is the one that has stepped into the actual limelight. And so with that kind of story sequencing, if Elijah is a Moses figure, but here he has groomed the man who is going to take over for him, and God has handpicked that successor who is going to step in and take over Elijah's ministry and mantle, then certainly we should be ready to anticipate that Elisha is going to be a Joshua figure, that Joshua is kind of the more predominant lens that we're supposed to be appreciating Elisha's ministry through. But that doesn't mean that we can't see some flavors of Moses baked in, or even other people potentially. So we should always be on the lookout for those sorts of things. But all that to say, if Joshua is the key figure by which we are supposed to interpret Elisha's ministry through, understanding that new things are being done through Elisha that Joshua never did. Joshua's ministry to Israel is primarily that of a military conquest and ordering the land so the people are ready once this generational change from his time to the next one after him that starts the book of Judges, that he is preparing them for the continuation of the conquest of the land and the eradication of these Canaanite peoples and the spreading of the presence and worship of Yahweh in the land. All that to say, this is not a physical conquest that Elijah is supposed to be manning here. He is manning more of a spiritual conquest, going back into the land to take possession of it away from the Amorites. And of course, that is part of the commissioning statement that is given to Elijah, who is told to go and anoint Elisha. But he is also supposed to anoint two other men that are going to serve as kings. One is the king over Aram, that is Hazael, and one as king over Israel, that is Jehu, who will bring utter devastation and destruction to the house of Ahab and will rule for 4 generations before his own house is destroyed. All that to say, he will do something in the way of what Elijah was hoping for in turning the people away from Baal, because the temple dedicated to Baal will be destroyed in Samaria, and in many ways will forecast the inevitable siege of Samaria, the destruction of the city, the ending of this line of dynasties and kings that have been ruling over Israel when the Assyrians come, and then ultimately deport these 10 tribes of Israelites off into wherever it was they sowed them in the empire that was under their control at that particular point in time. But all that to simply say, this spiritual conquest is not going to prevent that tidal wave of judgment, but what it will do is the very thing that God told Elijah, that he had preserved 7,000 who had not bowed the knee to Baal, had not kissed him and embraced him as Lord. And this remnant of Israelites is going to be the faithful community that Elisha will be working with and amongst, as he will also work with this group, or these various groups known as the sons of the prophets. And it will work to try to preserve Israel to an extent and ultimately prepare the people for what will come if they choose to stay in the northern kingdom, and that is exile, or if they choose to move into the southern kingdom, which they ultimately won't be escaping exile there either, but a remnant of faithful ones who will continue on in the tradition and words and wisdom of these prophets centuries later, once they are deported off into Babylon, and they be part of that community that comes to replant or reconstitute Israel, right? Anyway, so let's back up and look at chapter 3 here a little bit as we come to understand Elisha's ministry a little better. So here we have a different story in context than what we introduced this lesson with. Here we have a moment when Ahab is dead and his son Joram, or again, it's Jehoram, either one is acceptable, has taken over in his place. And for whatever reason, Moab waited until the death of Ahab to trigger a rebellion to throw off the chains and the fetters that had kept Moab bound. Remember, Moab, for the most part, had been subdued in the days of David, and they had been in this more or less tributary status and, being in some measure subservient to Israel, although David was not harsh to them the way that these Israelite kings were, because the Amorite dynasty, and we know this from I believe both biblical and extra biblical literature, but point being is that the Amorite dynasty, remembering that's Ahab's father Omri, And now this is Omri's grandson, Jehoram, on the throne, had imposed quite a bit of a heavy tribute on the Moabites with respect to how many rams or livestock animals and then precious metals, gold and silver, I think, that they're supposed to be ponying up every year. And so Moab has had their fill of this. They want no more. In fact, 1 Kings 3 begins with mentioning the fact that once Ahab dies, Moab chooses to rebel. And so with that, Judah's king, Jehoshaphat, is currently on the throne, and he is in line with the house of Ahab through marriage because he has married one of Ahab's daughters. We had this moment that ends the life of Ahab when Ahab, in an alliance with Jehoshaphat and Judah, attempted to go to war against the kingdom of Aram. And again, that's what orchestrates Ahab's death. Now, the son of Ahab is trying to do the same thing in coercing Jehoshaphat to go to war with him. Jehoshaphat did not learn the lesson he should have with respect to partnering with Ahab, and he says the same things with respect to Ahab's son. My people are your people, my horses your horses. So they in an alliance go, and they pick up the king of Edom along the way. And in doing this, what we should come to understand, let me close a couple of these windows here and open up my whiteboard app, that if this is the Dead Sea here, and of course this is the kingdom of Israel, this is the kingdom of Judah, this would be the kingdom of Edom, and then if this is the Jordan, then this would be the kingdom of Moab. And this area right here would be known as the plains of Moab. This would be known as the plains of Edom. This area over here called the wilderness of Zin and so forth. That's important because that's how this was described way back in patriarchal times under Moses and Aaron and so forth. So these two kings are traveling in this direction, and they pick up the king of Edom in an alliance. And I'm not sure why. It could have something to do with the fact these two kingdoms share a border between them, and Moab's power becoming unchecked as it is, maybe something of an existential threat to the king of Edom in their territory. I have no idea why he gets involved in this, but as they pick him up, they start moving in this direction to stage for the battle, which is going to take place here in the kingdom of Moab. That's important for us to understand. Let's continue on with this. So this triumvirate of kings converse amongst themselves, and they say, which route should we take? He replied, the route of the wilderness of Edom. So the king of Israel, the king of Judah, and the king of Edom set out. After they had traveled their indirect route for 7 days, they have no water for the army or the animals with them. So then the king of Israel said, oh no, the Lord has summoned these three kings only to hand them over to Moab. Now, if you were following me on our little map here, then what does this seem to kind of reconstruct? I know we have this movement here down the south side of the Dead Sea, but if you think about this particular movement, in fact, I'm just going to, if you can follow me here, erase all that we see here as if that's not going on. Because if we were to draw way down here, this being the kingdom of Egypt, and of course this, the Red Sea, which I can't quite draw because my tablet only gives me so much room. I know you like the bunny ears, right? Anyway, so if that was the Red Sea, which is not quite so close in proximity, but you get the point, that there was a time when Israel was pretty close to this area right here on the southern border around an area known as Kadesh Barnea. And after they left this area, they were supposed to be migrating to this spot over here where they're going to be staging for entrance into the land under Joshua to begin conquest. They were hoping to pass through the plains of Edom, but they can't. The king of Edom said no. He even uses his soldiers to make sure they understand the threat is real. You set any foot on our land, then we're going to come after you. So they have to go all the way down to the Red Sea. And I'm just going to erase this for a second so that way it makes some measure of sense. Pretend, if you will, that the Red Sea is way down here, because it's a very arduous journey that takes quite a bit of time to get to, because they have to circumvent the land of Edom all the way up to this point when they can finally enter into the plains of Moab. So anyway, the journey itself is quite similar in this regard once we get to this particular spot of the journey and we continue on. In other words, what we seemingly are reconstructing is a phase of Israel's wilderness wandering when they are about to end their 40 years out in the wilderness and approach Moab for the sake of entrance into the land. But what happens at that moment? Well, we go to Numbers chapter 20. The entire Israelite community entered the wilderness of Zin. If you remember, I said that's right around this area right here. And there was no water for the community, so they assembled against Moses and Aaron, and the people quarreled with Moses. And they said, "Why have you brought the Lord's assembly into this wilderness for us and our livestock to die here?" So this is very close to the end of this 40 years of wilderness wandering. And this is largely the new generation of people who have been raised up to replace their parents who brought them out of Egypt, right? And so all that to say, we have a very similar moment here when there's no water for the community. And what we have here back in 2 Kings 3 is the king of Israel saying, "This is the Lord's doing. He's brought us here to hand us over to the king of Moab. And that is going to happen by us being weakened from no water. And he is going to come out, ambush, and assault." And the people in Moses' day saying, "You've simply let us out here to just die because, of course, we're thirsty and there's not enough water for us." So the reason why that's important is because, granted, Elisha is part of this company of people. For whatever reason, the prophet has chosen to leave the land of Samaria and journey with these kings all the way out to this area, or they just happened to find him out there. Maybe he had reason and occasion to cross over the Jordan into this area earlier than they did, and someone knew that he was around this area, and they go and get him because he is summoned. But it's assumed that he is traveling with the company. All that to just simply point out that we have a close connection building, or so it would seem, off this initial point between the stories of Israel and their wilderness wandering, which of course comes on the back end of the Exodus arc, as they've left Egypt and are about to enter into the land of Canaan and finish the Exodus arc. So we always need to think of those things and the background. If stories are being connected from where we are currently reading to previous stories, what was the significance of the previous story there in the points that it connects with this story, and why does that matter? So let's see if there are any other connections. Verses 16 through 17 of 2 Kings 3. So there's a little bit of chit chat between Elisha and these kings, but ultimately he delivers to them what the Lord says, which is dig ditch after ditch in this wadi. So remember, a wadi is a dry riverbed. So in order for them to dig ditches, it must be free of water at this point and completely dried up. For the Lord has said, "You will not see wind or rain, but the wadi will be filled with water, and you will drink, you and your cattle and your animals." So God is apparently going to provide water in a supernatural way without the natural elements, i.e. wind, rain, clouds, all that stuff that would naturally bring rain from the heavens and fill these dry riverbeds in the rainy seasons. And they must be outside of the rainy season if this is a dry riverbed. Going back to Numbers 20, how does God answer the crisis moment with Israel in the wilderness? He does as he did at the beginning of their tenure in the desert after they left Egypt. He speaks to Moses, tells him the same thing, except for instead of striking the rock, he's supposed to speak to it. We know what happens with that story. We're not going to, emphasize that particular aspect of it, but it's just the simple fact that as they are to speak to the rock, they will watch and it will yield its water. There will be enough for them, the community, and their livestock. So almost the exact same phrase is being used here. And of course, in Numbers 20, it's God supernaturally providing water. And the person who makes this known to the people is God's spokesman, Moses in Numbers 20, Elisha in 2 Kings chapter 3. So already, as goes the beginning elements of Elisha's independent ministry, we are starting to see him as something of a Moses figure. But now we appreciate the fact, too, that this is a different biblical writer compiling these events in the book of 2 Kings. So that means there perhaps is a different agenda in mind here than just simply trying to point out that, hey, this is like a repeat of the Exodus, because there are quite a few variables that are different here. Not to mention, this is a time in Israel's kingship. There are actually two kingdoms of Israelite people. That is important, but also the type of king that is ruling over Israel proper, as goes a separate kingdom from the kingdom of Judah, which was something that Elisha pointed out when he said, the only reason I'm even doing anything and speaking to you, that being Jehoram, is because he had respect for King Jehoshaphat. Otherwise, he wouldn't have even give the other guy time of day. Doesn't even address the fact the king of Edom is there. Anyway, going back to 2 Kings 22, or chapter 3:22, when they got up early in the morning, the sun was shining on the water. The Moabites saw the water across from them was like red blood. or red like blood. And they all cry out, "This is blood," they exclaim. Where does this take us to? A moment where we have a miracle that's obviously a supernatural endeavor in which God uses water to impart truth to people by virtue of how he changes the water. Now, granted, in 2 Kings 3, God is not doing a single thing to change the water. It's just given the appearance of blood because of the way the sun is shining on it. But the exclamation that the people make, that this is blood, and what they understand it to be, and they assume that this triumvirate of kings somehow, I guess through just relational differences, because they're all distant relations toward each other, that they just, as Moab is too, but nonetheless, they decided that they couldn't get along, or somebody decided to insult somebody's mother, and they all started, as they say, crossing swords, and they must have killed most or all of their forces in the night hours. And of course, that is the reason why the water that was not there in the riverbed the day before, and the Moabites would have known that, it is what is actually filling the riverbed, not water itself. But with that, they are lured out to see this spectacle. And what they'll meet here in just a second is a surprise. But before we get to that, what does that sound like? Hopefully you're already thinking Exodus chapter 7, and this being the first moment after Moses and Aaron have already confronted Pharaoh in his palace. They go down to him when he is taking his ceremonial ritual morning bath in the Nile. And then while there, Moses takes the staff and he turns the water into blood. That does physically change and turn into blood. So with that, we are having different moments of the Exodus arc. But remember, that's a 40-year story that starts from them actually experiencing the plagues, leaving Egypt, and then spending 40 years in the wilderness. It wasn't supposed to be that long, but it does become that long, until eventually they wind up in the land of Canaan, crossing over under Joshua, as Moses has now died. But all of that is part of this Exodus story, right? So with that, it's only understandable we would see elements from different moments in that 40-year sequence, perhaps telescoped down into this particular moment that the writer of Kings is giving us. So it calls that back into the light with respect to the plagues of Egypt. Back to 2 Kings chapter 3. However, when the Moabites came to Israel's camp, the Israelites attacked them. They fled from them. So Israel went into the land attacking the Moabites. So in other words, what we could basically say as a summary statement is what they perceived was blood, but is actually water that is risen up from the land of Edom into this dry riverbed, and now has branched off into these ditches that were dug from the wadi or attached to the wadi, that it is actually water, that it becomes a source of death for the Moabites, not because they ingest it or anything like that, but the fact that they thought it was blood. They assumed these armies had decimated each other. They chose to go out there and see the spoil that they expected to see, and then perhaps loot and plunder the bodies, and then make open sport of the fact their enemies are defeated, and then bring back trophies to give to their great god Chemosh, or whatever the case might be. But that's not what happens. They are unassumingly lured into a trap, and these armies perhaps are waiting in ambush. And when this happens, they turn on the Moabites, who are obviously not prepared for battle, as they have not marched out, I would think, in battle formation. And with that, they launch a great campaign against the Moabites, taking them by surprise, catching them off guard. And then it continues to build in momentum until eventually the Moabites are completely pushed back into their land. Many cities are going to be captured and conquered. And the skirmish itself will find its end at the capital city that's there, Kir Harsheth. I'm trying to pronounce it right, but my brain doesn't want to work with my tongue, down here in verse 25. So with that, we go back to Exodus 14, and we have that same moment when it's not the water that was turned into blood, but it is another body of water that God has supernaturally acted upon, that being the Red Sea, to open it up. And these walls of water become a conduit of life for Israel walking through, but those waters become a channel of death, or a conduit of death for the Egyptians that go into it, lured into the trap of thinking they could overtake the Israelites. But God brings the water down on their heads and destroys them all. But it's not water that kills the Moabites. It's just the very thing that springs the trap. But I think there's definitely a close enough connection between the two to say that the story continues to build along this Exodus arc that we've seen, right? So going back to 2 Kings 3, verse 9, we've already read this verse. As you can see, it backs up a little bit. After they had traveled their indirect route for 7 days, this, I think, actually starts to incorporate some elements of the holy war that is begun under Joshua in the conquest phase. of the Exodus, because until they are firmly settled in the land and experiencing the blessings of this land that God spoke about through Moses, one that is like a land flowing with milk and honey, one could reasonably argue that the Exodus itself is not done yet. So during the conquest period, when they're supposed to be following God like they did in the wilderness with faith leading them, that's what they are successfully doing, and that they are, of course, in every way winning the effort here. So all that to say, that starts to bring in some of this element of Joshua and the people marching around the city of Jericho 6 days, once a day, and then on the seventh day, 7 times. I think in some ways this very clearly parallels what we're seeing here in this 7-day route that they take to finally get to the place where they are going to begin the battle campaign. Then to verse 25 of 2 Kings 3. And this went on until only the buildings of Kir Hareseth were left, the capital of Moab. Then the men with slings surrounded the city and attacked it, which is exactly what happens in the conquest of Jericho, is it not? That the battle itself begins there at the walls once the people have circled around it 7 times, blow the ram's horns, they begin to shout with a mighty voice, and then God brings the walls crashing down on top of them. But here's the rub, because we're not going to finish this story, but I just want to sum it up in saying that what we would anticipate then, if we've been following this story and thinking of it with the measures of, or the points of connection between it and the book of Exodus and book of Joshua, then we would think God is already starting to give victory into the hands of the Israelites, and that it's going to turn out to be a smashing success for them. But it doesn't. Granted, they do a lot to ultimately bring Moab back under boot for a brief period of time and weaken them. But once they press this advantage all the way up to this city, Kir Hareseth, some things that Elisha predicted that they were going to do, and stopping up all the wells of water, cutting down all the trees, and then throwing big stones on tops of the parcels of land that would be used for agricultural means and so forth. Elisha is not condoning any of those actions. If anything, what he is calling out are the very things that Moses said in the book of Deuteronomy they were not to do when they engage in war against other cities outside of the land of Canaan. They are not to be cutting down fruit-bearing trees. They are not to do these other things that people like the Assyrians are going to be notable for with respect to waging war not only against the people, but seemingly against the land, because the Assyrians would do heinous things like not only throw big boulders on the parcels of agricultural land, but even sow the fields with salt so that nothing would grow. Even wild growth wouldn't come in the next few years. So they were not to make war against the land. They were to use what could be used, such as non-fruit-bearing trees, for their siege towers or siege works, but not all these other things. And so Elisha certainly would not be, if he's holding them accountable to the covenant that they entered into with God at Sinai, and this, of course, includes the words of Moses in Deuteronomy, he would not be then compelling them to break those commands. If anything, he's just predicting that's what they're going to do, and they hold true to that. That's exactly what they do. All that to say, once they get to this particular moment when Kir Hareseth seems to be a new Jericho, they're laying siege to it, that we would expect God to give them victory by this helping supernaturally destroy Kir Hareseth. Instead, the king of Moab, when he is unsuccessful in trying to press through with 700 swordsmen to the king of Edom to kill him and then maybe turn the tide in their favor, instead he takes the crowned heir and kills him by offering him up as a burnt offering on the walls of the city. And with this, wrath breaks out against Israel. Perhaps God bringing wrath because of what they had done in destroying the land through the battle campaign as they had, which at this point perhaps has lasted days or weeks on end. All that to say, as is the fashion of the writer of Kings, he takes this story and turns it on its head. He waits till the last second, but he turns it on its head, because then Israel flees, and the story does not end with them getting a resounding victory over Moab, as one might think. Instead, it works out against them because God brings wrath on their heads. And we would assume that Jehoshaphat and his warriors are not spared this. And we don't know exactly what form the wrath came in, but it stopped the war nonetheless, or the battle campaign. But just appreciating this for what it is, as goes introducing Elisha to us, what we can clearly see and appreciate is a measure of him being something of a new Moses-like figure, number one, And number two, it draws our eyes a little deeper into the words of Torah. And we need to appreciate the hyperlinks that are being built into the text for us that refer back to places like that. In other words, never in the mouths of any of these prophets do we ever hear them saying, as was said by the words of, or in the words of Moses, the Lord's servant, and then quoting a direct piece from Torah. If anything, allusions are baked into that when they are calling into question the practices of the Israelites, and then making statements that we should be able to clearly see are rooted very firmly in the words of Torah itself. And so I hope that we can appreciate some of that tonight. In other words, what we're beginning to see here is that if he is something of a new Moses and a new Joshua-like figure, that he is beginning to lead something of a spiritual conquest in claiming the hearts of the people and garnering or calling out an Israel within the Israel of his day. In other words, the several thousand that have been reserved by the Lord, and again, the sons of the prophets that he is going to be working with and amongst to try to continue to revive the people and prevent their overall demise and God's sweeping judgment coming in now, rather than several centuries later when that moment does wind up finally coming. And there are many different parallels that I would love to try to isolate with you with respect to the ministry of Elisha, that if Elijah shared much in favor, or I should say much in common with John the Baptist, much can be said in the way of Elisha. Also, then, if he is Elijah's successor, then Jesus in many ways was John the Baptist's successor, as goes John the Baptist beginning to preach the message, the kingdom of heaven is at hand, and the people need to repent and prepare their hearts, because he was the one sent to cry as the voice in the wilderness, for the mountains to be made low and the valleys to be raised up and every crooked path made straight, for a broad highway to be paved out, because the Lord is on his way. Forecasting this time of the Messiah's entrance into the scene, bringing about this never-ending era of peace and prosperity for Israel and the subduing of the nations. If that's what he is forecasting, that's what's supposed to be happening. But when Jesus comes on the scene, he continues to preach this message. The kingdom of heaven is at hand. And granted, it doesn't quite come in the way they expected, but it does indeed wind up coming, as proven by all the many ways he manifests the kingdom. All that to say, there are even other and deeper parallels. As much as Elijah is a Moses figure, Elisha is a Joshua figure, and then again, Elijah has a lot in common with Jesus. And if that's the case, then who are Jesus' successors but the disciples, the apostles, who carry on the mantle of Jesus' ministry after he leaves the scene? And he, of course, continues to work through them and carrying out that mission through them as he's passed this mission and its mantle onto their shoulders. But we don't have time to isolate all these parallels. If I was going to do that, I should have already started, and I still, in an hour and a half time, wouldn't have sufficient time to get through all of them, to do them all justice. And I don't even have many of the scripture references that I would like to here, because my outline, which is already burgeoning into 5 pages, would easily turn into 15 pages. And we don't have time to go through all of that. All that to say, I leave that for you to study out a little bit deeper, but I am going to introduce us to that. I'm going to do a little bit more than just dip our toes in it, maybe up to our ankle perhaps, but whet your appetite a little bit and give you the tools you need to go back and research these things for yourself by calling them out and saying you should pay attention to those things in the text. And then hopefully they start to pop off the page to you and you can see those connections come to life. Anyway, now going to chapter 4, where our text for this lesson today actually begins. So, excuse me. In verse 1 of this chapter, which we have not read yet, and then down in verse 20 and verse 40, as you can see highlighted on the page for you, there is a word or some form of it that is used at the beginning, middle, and end of this chapter that seem to sum up something of a theme that's operative here in this concourse of stories that are different from each other, and that is death. Death seems to be prevailing in the land. And the question then is, why? Why is death prevailing in the land? Is God bringing judgment? I would say yes. Doesn't mean he has to overtly bring judgment in the form of a plague that is ravaging through the people like wildfire, but to allow them to have what it is they ultimately want, and that is to tear their allegiance away from him and to give it over to all these other gods, but he is the one that is the giver of life. And so therefore, if they tear themselves away from him, naturally death is what will ensue. In the words of Moses in the books of at least Exodus and the later portions, all the way up through Deuteronomy in several different places, the way he frames this up is in the guise of you must be obedient, and if you're not, then death will ensue as the proper consequence. But there are many reasons why death ensues. Certainly, it is the direct consequence of sin, as we are told in the beginning of the story of Scripture, with respect to what Adam and Eve were told not to do. And if they do, this is what will happen. They will indeed die. But also because of the fact that death is also what, again, as I said, happens when one walks away from the giver of life. And it's the natural consequence of what will happen when you turn yourself over to the lustfulness and carnality of your flesh as it slowly starts to consume and then destroy you. So death is ultimately pictured as separation from Yahweh, but it can even be seen as a measure of separation that we experience here in this life as well. So all that to say, death has come about because in Exodus chapter 3, verse 8, again, God speaking to Moses at the burning bush, told him to tell the people that I've come down to rescue them from the power of the Egyptians, to bring them to a land that is good and spacious, a land flowing with milk and honey, obviously, where life is prevailing and thriving, and that he intends for them to be blessed with as an inheritance. And then Moses would later on tell them at the end of his journey with them, follow the whole instruction of the Lord your God that he has commanded you, so that you may live and prosper and have long life in the land you will possess. If we understand that the sequencing of this story from Genesis all the way up to this point has been image bearer, but that ultimately failed, which doesn't mean other people are not going to be image bearers any longer. Humans continue to be, albeit not quite in the same way that Adam was, with all the regality that he had as a king, and of course with the measure of commission that he shared with his wife as going or as being priests. Nonetheless, what they eventually wind up converging on as this experiment is resurrected and brought forth in the people of Abraham coming into the land is that God coronates another image-bearing figure that is going to be walking around in the consecrated sacred space of the tabernacle, which is like a new Garden of Eden, the priest. But of course, we get to the days of Eli, and it's not to say this line of priests ends. It's still operative, even up in the time of Jesus. All that to simply say, though, that God seems to transition this concept of the priests being the one who will lead the people, at least in the person of the high priest, and the commission that they have of teaching the people the difference between clean and unclean, holy and common, and helping by virtue of the Levites in their ministry for the people to continue to understand and be mindful of the words and wisdom that God has given through Moses and Torah. But Eli has desecrated that. So God then, in the time of Samuel, transitions over to a king. The kings are supposed to be leading the people, but certainly we have seen, as is the case in the days of Solomon toward the end of his life, Jeroboam, and the kings that have prevailed or passed since then, that the kings have not proven to be the person who, as God's new image-bearing covenant partner, are supposed to be leading the people like David did. They're just carrying them further away from God. And with that, God has now, through the time of Elijah and into Elisha's day, as what we discussed last week with respect to God saying, I'm not going to be demonstrating my presence and power in the form of fire and earthquake and rattling wind any longer, or at least for a time, but rather the still small voice. And the person who is going to wield this still small, quiet, whisper-like voice is going to be the prophet, right? And so that's why Elijah and Elisha are taking such a measure of dominance in the narrative space that we have, because the kings, this is the point I want to make, the kings have led them into death. As it was in the days of Eli, the priest has led them into death. God exiling himself with allowing the ark to be taken by the Philistines, and the Philistines bringing a great measure of judgment against the people through military conquest, subduing them, almost enslaving them in their own land, and of course, destroying the tabernacle. And so now, priests of those days led them to death. The kings are now filling the land with death through their idolatrous and apostate-like decisions, in which case God, in one more measure, is choosing to try to lead them back to the fruitfulness that will come from the life he chooses to give by covenant obedience, if they will just simply listen to his words, which has been part of their legacy from the beginning, right? With Moses all the way up until now, God has not left them for a long period of time without his word or visions being shared with them through people that he raises up. Albeit in the days of the judges, it was a little bit more rare and sparse, but it wasn't altogether extinguished, right? So anyway, that's a theme that we need to keep in mind here. Now, going back to verse 1 again, as death has come to visit the house of one of these sons of the prophets that Elisha knew well, because his wife comes to Elisha and says, "Your servant, my husband, has died. You know that your servant feared the Lord. Now the creditor is coming to take my 2 children as slaves." And this is horrible. Remember that this is the prayer of Solomon, or some psalm writer, attributing it to Solomon's time when he was king. In Psalm 72, the prayer over him is that God would give his justice to the king. And the prayer would also go on to request that he would vindicate the afflicted people, the poor, and help crush the one who, as the oppressor, would dare raise his boot to try to crush or grind to powder the, perhaps innocent's not quite the right word, but vulnerable ones for sure. And the reason why was because the king, as the supreme judge in the land, and again, as it says in Psalm 2, the adopted son of the Lord ruling at his right hand, is supposed to be the one who is looking out for these particular people, these classes of Israelite citizens who cannot fend for themselves and need the justice that the king will offer to prevent this kind of measure of oppression, so that the land does not become like in Egypt. But again, these kings have failed to do this. But there are also provisions built into the law that would help instruct the king, who was supposed to write his own copy of the law, to know exactly how to deal with these kinds of measures. Back in Leviticus 25, Moses told the people, "If your brother among you becomes destitute and sells himself to you, you must not force him to do slave labor." So presumably, there would be no reason to think that this woman, who is afraid of what is going to befall her 2 sons, and is coming to Elisha to beg for some measure of reprieve and help, is not an Israelite man who is going to take and snatch up her sons and press gang them into lifelong servitude as slaves until they can pay off this debt. Or maybe even after the debt is paid off, there may be no measure of freedom. We don't know just how debauched the people are at this point and how far they have allowed themselves to drift from the wisdom of God's counsel in the words of Moses. And if anything, Moses says he's supposed to stay with them as a hired worker or a temporary resident, and he may work for you until the year of Jubilee. So even if a debt is not paid off, there is supposed to come a time of reprieve when in the 7th year, debts are altogether canceled. Or if we make it to the year of Jubilee, then all slaves are supposed to be sent home, released, go back to where their ancestral lands are. And they are not just simply turned out with empty pockets to say, "Okay, fine, I got to let you go." No, Moses says that they are supposed to basically be turned out as if to say they were Israelites leaving Egypt, having spoiled Egypt and taking their articles of gold and silver, provisions of food to go along with them, right? Because these people who buy their fellow brothers as servants and allow them to work to pay off their debt and so forth, they are supposed to open up their pantries and their storehouses and give them food and articles of clothing and jewels and whatnot to go off back to where they came from, as if they are getting a fresh new start, and they hopefully won't wind up in this kind of situation again, right? It says, "Then he and his children are to be released from you, so that he may return to his clan and his ancestral property. And they cannot be sold as slaves, because they are my slaves. I brought you up out of the land of Egypt." So in other words, what's happening here in this story with this woman who is destitute and is afraid for her sons, this is not supposed to be a practice that is even allowable in Israel, that someone can just come because debt is owed to them and snatch up family members of the person who owes the debt and sell them as slaves. But that unfortunately is what's going on. So how does Elisha meet this? He tells her to go and borrow empty containers, because in the space between this, he asked the woman, "What do you have?" She says, "A jar of oil." He says, "Go out and borrow empty containers from all your neighbors. Do not get just a few. Then go in, shut the door behind you, you and your sons. Pour oil into these containers and set the full ones to the side." Then he tells her to sell all of those and pay off the debt and live off the rest. He's helping a widow here, which in many ways parallels to what Elijah, his predecessor, did when he went to the widow of Zarephath, right, who was destitute in and of herself with respect to what she owned. And she was about to make the last little bit of food her and her son were going to eat before they just decided to starve to death. But of course, she makes some cake for him, and he eats it. And then they thrive off a little bit of meal or flour and oil that God continues to replenish all the way up until the time years later when the famine is finally over with. So much in the way that Elijah helped a widow, so will Elisha, but Elisha is helping a widow in the land, not one outside the land. There's a key difference there. But also to say that we're not to just simply appreciate Elisha's ministry as just being a continuance of Elijah's, and that he is mirroring those miracles and doing the same types of things, just with slightly different circumstances involved. That's not it at all. Again, Elijah's ministry being something of one to people outside the land, which was a measure of judgment upon Israel, as Jesus calls out in Luke chapter 4, right? But Elisha's ministry is also going to be to people who Israel would not find favorable, but mostly these miracles will happen inside the land. So it's a ministry of life to the community of people who want to continue to be faithful to Yahweh. And this is a continuance of Elijah's work. Elijah was upset at the fact that people didn't just come down off Mount Carmel and start destroying all these shrines and altars to Baal, which is what he presumed would happen with the way they responded on Mount Carmel. But as he was assured on Mount Sinai that God had preserved several thousand who, again, had not given their allegiance and loyalty to Baal, this would be the community that Elisha would work with and continue to nurture and work as something of a vine dresser with this trellis that a vine is growing on to continue to produce some measure of meager fruit that will influence not only them, but maybe even influence the nations, right? So there's a parallel there. But what we also need to understand is, with respect to what he's doing, as we go back to Leviticus 25, some verses down from where we were with this statute here about if a brother is destitute, has to sell himself, how you are to accord him. Down in verses 47 through 48, if an alien or temporary resident living amongst you prospers, but your brother living near him becomes destitute and sells himself to the alien living among you, or to a member of the resident alien's clan, he has the right of redemption after he has been sold. One of his brothers may redeem him. That would be the right and the obligation, perhaps, of a kinsman redeemer. So the point I make with respect to that is what that is exactly what Elisha is doing here. Now, granted, he is not perhaps a direct family member of this son of the prophet who is noted as the servant, the husband to this woman who is coming to him, begging for him to just simply do something. But nonetheless, it seems like Elisha accords him as family. And because of the fact there is a very real threat here that no one else is powerful enough to stop from happening, because it's now seemingly become an accepted practice that her sons are going to be taken from her, or children are going to be taken from her and pressed into slavery. That the circumstance of Leviticus 25 of destitution falling on a family to the point where they can't make ends meet and they have to sell themselves, and they do. And they may even wind up selling themselves to people who are living in the land of Israel, but are not native Israelites. That if that were to happen, the law of the land is that when the situation arises where this person can be redeemed because a family member hears about it, has the money to pay off that person's debt and free them from bondage, they can do that very thing. That right is there, and it cannot be prevented. So Elisha is acting like a kinsman redeemer and an actual blood relative to the son of the prophet who has died here, and his wife is coming to him for reprieve, in that he is telling her how she can prevent this very thing from happening. But notice, it would not have happened had Elisha not worked in her stead by exercising the supernatural gifting of God's power upon him to multiply the oil to the point where it was poured out into all of these different containers until the last one was filled, and then the oil stopped. So I hope that point of connection is clear there. Because as we transition away from that story, we go to the one that's familiar to us from what we read in the beginning of this, with this Shunammite lady who wanted to do this extraordinary thing for Elisha. And so when this happened, Elisha asked, then what should we do for her? His assistant Gehazi said, Well, she has no son, and her husband is old. So again, a barren womb, and in some ways, this calls out the story of Sarah and Abraham, because Abraham was already noted to be old. This woman is not said to be old, and we should not think that's the case. If anything, perhaps part of the reason why she has not had a child is due to the fact of her husband's advanced age, though men are virile up until the very late stages of life. All that to simply say, we don't know why she hasn't had a child. But what we do know is that not only is this seen as a measure of shame, but there's a very real chance that any measure of inheritance this husband would pass on obviously is not going to be inherited by a child of his, because he has no son. And if that's the case, it doesn't just simply go to his wife. Sadly, it may wind up becoming the property of another person, either a member of the family close to them, which would be a kinsman redeemer, or it may be snatched up by somebody else. And it very well may be that where Shunem is in the northern kingdom, that kind of thing could have happened. If people were willing to ignore the law of Moses and just snatch people up and press gang them into slavery to pay off debts, who's to say that a person would not be licking their chops and waiting for a moment when an old man like this with no sons would die to come and snatch up that property, like in something of an auction sale or whatever, and his poor widow can do nothing to stop that, and perhaps none of his family members, right? Anyway, so he tells Gehazi to call her. So Gehazi called her. She stood in the doorway. Elisha said, at this time next year. Now, of course, when we read that, we're just thinking, okay, 12 calendar months from now. But what this actually says in Hebrew is at the time of living. Or at the time of life, which is supposed to be understood as springtime. So he's actually situating this for us so that we understand at the time of the renewal of things come the following year, when winter is over with and the first signs of spring start to be manifested by the blossoming of new vegetation and plant life, and the rainy seasons coming and so forth, that at that time she would be holding that son in her arms, which of course is very much reminiscent of the very message that God and the two angels that came with him when he came to visit Abraham on underneath the oaks of Mamre, and told Sarah that no, the time has come. Indeed, this time next year, you will be holding this child that you are laughing about now with respect to the idea of you in your advanced age actually having. Anyway, this woman goes on to say, no, my Lord, man of God, do not lie to your servant. She is just completely taken aback by this. She's almost stumbling over her own unbelief here and thinking, this can't happen. Please don't tease me. But the woman did conceive and gave birth to a son at the time that was specified the following year, as Elisha had promised her. But now here's the thing. We know that the son is ultimately going to die. But before we get to that, let's appreciate what's going on here. That in another place in Torah, Deuteronomy 25, we have the law of the kinsman redeemer being introduced yet again, but this time it's not for the redemption of land and property or for those members of the family who have become destitute and sold themselves into slavery. This now is perhaps one of the more controversial ones, and that goes the exercise of levirate marriage, and that being when brothers live on the same property and one of them dies without a son, the wife of the dead man may not marry a stranger outside the family. Her brother-in-law is to take her as a wife, have sexual relations with her, and perform the duty of a brother-in-law to her. The first son she bears will carry on the name of the dead brother, so that his name will not be blotted out of Israel. So after offering the lady, can we do something perhaps by appealing to the king or the commander of the army for you? She's reiterating yet again, no, I'm fine. I don't need anything. Elisha is the one that offers this miracle and reinforces it by saying, yes, indeed, at this time next year, you will have this child. So she has been childless because her husband, who is very close to death, perhaps as an old man, is going to potentially leave her childless. And again, without that child to inherit his father's estate, it creates a big measure of vulnerability for the widow now. And that is part of the wonderful blessing that comes in the book of Ruth with respect to Boaz acting as a kinsman redeemer and restoring the lands and property and all that stuff that belonged to Naomi's side of the family within the family, as it would continue to pass on through Boaz's son through Ruth, that being Obed, right? So all that to say here, even though Elisha is not the one who actually goes into the woman and does what must be done in order for human life to be conceived in the womb of a woman, Yet we know it certainly can be done supernaturally, and it was. Not to say that her husband wasn't the one who provided what was needed. Certainly it may have been and probably was. No reason to think that this is anything other than the normal means of human conception. But what happens here is because the prophet acts to open the woman's womb and bless her with a child, that it would seem like he is certainly acting like a kinsman redeemer by raising up a child to the almost, as it was said of Abraham while he was still alive, yet he considered himself as good as dead because of the fact he was old, advanced in age, had no son. And when God was promising a son, he had a hard time, struggling at moments with believing this was ever actually going to happen. So, in yet another story in the same chapter, we have Elisha acting as a kinsman redeemer. I'm going somewhere with this, so just hold on. This is supposed to be 2 Kings chapter 4. I'm sorry, a bit of a typo here. So 2 Kings 4, verses 31. So the boy has died. That was what was introduced to us at the beginning of this chapter when he goes out to the field with his father and he says, my head, my head. He's taken back to his mother. He dies in her lap. And then she puts him up in Elisha's room on the bed that she made for him. And then she goes to find him. And when Gehazi sees her coming, Elisha recognizes it's her. He sends Gehazi out to see what's the matter. She says nothing's wrong. So he escorts her up to Elisha's presence. And when she gets there, the whole story changes because she says, didn't I tell you not to lie to me? In other words, you gave me this wonderful blessing and now you've only taken it away. Kind of like the widow that Elijah helped because her son died too. That's the very one that Elijah works to raise to life. And she said, did you just simply come here to call my sins into question and take my son away from me, right? So yet again, another point of parallel with Elijah's ministry. But another interesting thing here is that Elisha tells his servant Gehazi to go ahead of him and to place his staff on the boy's face, almost as if to say it's like Moses' staff, right? That is the very thing that brought the plagues down from heaven and opened up the waters for the people of Israel to cross through, that struck the rock these multiple times and brought forth water and all those things. Certainly, it's not endued with magical power. I'm not saying that. It's just the simple fact that it's as if to say that's kind of what's going on here. So Gehazi does this. He takes the staff back and he beats Elisha there. He makes it to the upper room. He puts the staff down by the boy, but nothing happens, which in some ways is kind of eerily reminiscent of what we had back in 1 Kings 18 when we have Elijah challenging the prophets of Baal, and they cut up their bull and they start crying out to Baal, and nothing happens. Why does nothing happen? Because Baal is not the giver of life, as much as they might like to think so, with him being touted as the storm god. That's, of course, the one who brings the rain so that the fertility cycles of the earth can ensue and crops come and harvest happens and all that stuff. He is no giver of life because he's inert. As much as the staff, aside from Elisha's presence, is inert, because once Elisha arrives on the scene, as much as Elijah coming to Mount Carmel and then him being the one that sacrifices a bull, water poured over top of it, God manifests himself in fire as he did at Mount Sinai, bringing life to the people. And of course, the king now enjoying fellowship with God, and a moment in which Israel could have renewed their covenant agreement with God and walking away from the apostasy of Jeroboam and truly following God's lead through Elijah. Sadly, that didn't happen. But nonetheless, I digress, getting out of my rabbit hole I dug myself into. Elisha shows up on the scene, and when he does, they say the boy won't wake up. So he goes up to the room, he sees him dead, he goes into him, he closes the door behind them, and he prays to the Lord as Elijah had prayed over that dead son of the widow. The boy sneezes 7 times. That may in some way mimic kind of what was going on when Adam came to life after being carved out of the clay before God breathed into him. And then when God breathed into him, he becomes a living soul. This boy sneezing is receiving life, breath, ruach, God's spirit back into him. All that to say that what we have here is another moment in which Elisha, I knew it was going to happen, is acting like something of a kinsman redeemer because he gives the boy not only once, but twice to his mother. Now, moving on, because time is pressing for us here, and I'm just about to get into the 3rd page, so I've got to move a little quicker. This very same woman is also the subject of chapter 8, which I know wasn't part of our original readings, but that's okay. It's necessary for us to connect this, to continue to build on this kinsman redeemer motif here. Because in 2 Kings 8, Elisha said to the woman whose son he had restored to life, get ready, you and your household, because God is going to bring famine, kind of like he did in the days of Joseph here, 7 years. And he tells him, or tells them, they need to go live in a land apart from Israel as resident aliens. So they go live with the Philistines, Israel's long held enemies. They do so for 7 years. And then after that, they come back. And when she comes back, she went to appeal to the king for her household and her field. And the king asked the woman, because Gehazi was there at that particular time, quite fortuitous, and he actually was speaking to the king about the things Elisha had done. And he says, hey, this is actually the woman I was just telling you about, whom Elisha had raised her son to life after he had blessed her with opening up her womb to give her that son in the first place. And so the king wants to be regaled with the story from the person who experienced it. So she indeed tells the king all the things that happened. And so the king appointed a court official to her, saying, restore all that was hers, along with the income from the field from the day she left the country until this very moment, which again goes back to Leviticus 25. All I had read from Leviticus 25 earlier was just the redemption by virtue of near kinsmen redeemers of family members who have sold themselves into servitude. This is that measure of legislation I had also alluded to a little earlier, and saying that land can also be redeemed, because the land is not to be permanently sold. It's mine. You're only aliens. He's not talking about foreigners living in the land. He's saying the Israelites too are aliens on the land. It's God's. You are to allow the redemption of any land you occupy. If your brother becomes destitute and sells part or all of it, then his nearest relative may come and redeem what his brother has sold. So Elisha told the woman to leave. Now, the woman could have made the choice at this moment to ignore it, but she doesn't. Elisha could not have told her, and she could have stuck it out in the land, or acted like Naomi and left the land to go find reprieve somewhere else and then come back and hopefully some way get the land back after leaving it desolate for 7 years. Somebody surely is going to squat on it and take it. How's she going to get it back? Naturally appeal to the king, but we can't trust kings in Israel this time to do what's right by virtue of the law, the words that God had spoken through Moses. So all that to say, Elisha, even though he's not there at this particular moment, but through his servant Gehazi, is acting like a kinsman redeemer again, because by the king being moved by this story that's being told by Elisha's assistant, the king appoints an official to say, not only are you going to give her all the land that was originally hers, but any money that would have been made off of that land and the produce that would have come from it, even during a period of famine in which nothing was growing, give her that money. So now she's got money to come back into the land to live off of as she goes to reclaim her property. Yet again, Elisha acting as a kinsman redeemer. Now, why does this matter? Because, friends, I think in many ways, this is perhaps part of what we wind up missing, as there are many things to capture in Luke 4. When in this unique moment in the gospel narratives, Luke is capturing something that none of his other peers are writing about. When that moment that Jesus walks into the synagogue of his hometown that he had been raised in from the time he was a boy up until the time he is baptized by John in the Jordan, that he walks in, as was his custom on the Sabbath, and they offer him the chance to read, which was something he customarily did. He asks for the Isaiah scroll. He opens it up to where we would call Isaiah 61, and he begins to read this. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to preach the good news to the poor. And we might give the hearty, rousing amen to that, to say, yes, he has come to preach the good news of him coming to die for our sins. And then we just kind of let everything else fade off into the background. But what he goes on to say here is that he sent me to proclaim release to the captives. And we might be thinking of those who are actually in prison, as I myself was imprisoned in my sins. I'm, again, not trying to overly characterize these things. I'm just saying oftentimes we only see these particular verses through the lens of individual salvific redemption. And that is not how we're to see these stories. That is a part of it, yes. And it adds an extra and very meaningful layer into the meaning of what is supposed to be understood by this. But the larger picture here is actually what is coming from the words of Moses in Leviticus 25 and Deuteronomy 25. The idea of captives who have been sold into slavery by virtue of their own doing, or somebody else may have press ganged them into slavery. But come the year of Jubilee, it's the year of release. Everything gets put back to its reset point, which is the time in which they entered into the land and began to conquer it under Joshua. And then he orders the land by giving them the allotments that Moses said were to go to the people. And then, of course, the ones that Joshua has to work with Eleazar Aaron's son to carve out for those tribes who had not been given allotted inheritance by Moses. So everything goes back to its reset point. All the land that had been sold and exchanged hands is to go back to the original clans and the tribes. It started out as goes its original inheritance claim. And then again, all debts are canceled, and the entire land is supposed to undergo a sabbatical cycle in which no work is going to be done in the way of livestock maintenance or agricultural work. The land gets to rest, the animals get to rest, the people get to rest. It's as if they're all leaving Egypt all over again and are bound for the promised land. And anyway, recovery of sight to the blind, to set free the oppressed, and to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. So this is indeed him saying, as Isaiah was forecasting, which would come with the Messianic age, the year of Jubilee was typical or typifying the year, the time in which the Messiah would come and bring ultimate release and rest to the land that would never end, as it would be the case with the year of Jubilee, 12 months, and it's over with, and now it's another 50 years until we get to that particular moment. But nonetheless, this is what is supposed to be captured here, right? And so it's important for us to appreciate that fact, because again, if Elijah is like John the Baptist, then Elisha is like Jesus. Or perhaps we should invert those and say John is like Elijah and Jesus like Elisha. And the ministry of these two prophets in the Old Testament is not to just simply foreshadow the arrival of John and Jesus, but it is set in place for us to better understand what John and Jesus are doing on the scene. Because Jesus isn't simply coming to just die for our sins, friends. There's 3 years worth of ministry there, lots of teaching and miracles. And we, of course, may scratch our heads at some of the things he's saying or the reasons why he's performing these miracles. And he draws our attention to it in many places where he alludes to these prior stories. And of course, when we see the patterning of events that the actual writers of these gospel accounts, with tons of information to pull from, of the stories and sayings, as John tells us in his gospel, look, the volumes of the books in the world wouldn't contain it all, but I chose to write these things, the hand-picked, carefully selected things I isolated for you, so that you would arrive at the inescapable conclusion, Jesus is indeed the Son of God. So he crafted that gospel narrative for that intent, as the other gospel writers are crafting their narratives with the idea in mind that you'll follow the sequence of the stories, you'll see how they're framed, you'll see the particular highlights that are pointed to with respect to the echoes of previous Old Testament figures like Abraham and Moses and David and these prophets of Elijah, Elisha, Isaiah, Jeremiah, and so forth. And, many of these notable figures that Jesus is being patterned after for the sake of showing not only is he the antitype and fulfillment of that particular type in the Old Testament, but those parts of the Old Testament story are being rehashed to show that all the roosters are finally coming home to crow, right? That the cows are finally coming home, that all the storylines are wrapping up to their inevitable conclusion and finding their redemption in their broken arc in Jesus, right? So anyway, now to bring this whole thing together with respect to Elisha as a kinsman redeemer, because Jesus, when he comes to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor, of this time of release, isn't the ultimate near kinsman redeemer, is he not? He is God becoming our brother, incarnating himself in human flesh, identifying with us in this den of vice and misery, and then choosing to ultimately redeem it all and set it free and make all things new. So Elisha's ministry, as much as it is a reclamation of the land, as Joshua's ministry was in claiming it to begin with through conquest, he's doing the same thing that ultimately helps us better understand the ministry of Jesus. Because again, friends, that's the way the gospel narratives are written. Jesus' ministry begins in Galilee in all of these gospel narratives and ultimately converges on Jerusalem as the place of final conquest showdown with the religious and political leaders who want to snuff him out, and he allows them to think they gained the upper hand in killing him. But ultimately what they fail to realize is that what he is doing is taking our place as the vicarious atoning sacrifice that provides us the ultimate release from sin, from death, allows us to no longer be oppressed by the ruler of this world, so that we can now become citizens and children of his kingdom and covenant, right? So another thing to appreciate here, if we're starting to thumb along that vibe of Elisha being like a Joshua, and Joshua was the one who erected the tabernacle in the land, the Garden of Eden, for the new consecrated Adam figure of the high priest to represent the people in and to bring the life-giving blessings of Eden to the people, and not just Israel, but ultimately the nations. That Elisha is going to be something like that. And then how exactly does this point to Jesus, right? And again, I'd give you a ton of scripture references, but I don't have them. I just want to show you, though, we don't have a lot left, so just bear with me. So going back to the story of Elisha and this woman in Shunem, that she decided to prepare him this little space, right? She says to her husband, I know that the one who passes by here is a holy man of God. We need to appreciate something here. This word holy, as it's used in prior contexts in scripture, resoundingly throughout the book of Leviticus. There are warnings with respect to touching things that are holy or doing things that are violations of God's holiness or his holy things that come in the form of severe punishments, maybe even death in the case of Nadab and Abihu, or the need for restitution through sacrifice, the giving of a ram because of what a person has done in violating the Lord's holy things. Because the understanding is whatever is deemed holy by virtue of God's speeches in the book of Leviticus belongs squarely to God and nobody else. God allows the priests and Levites to partake of his holy things, as goes food offerings, and handle his holy things because they are consecrated for that purpose. But there is supposed to be a very clear and discernible line between God, his holiness, and what is considered common or profane. So for that connotation to come over into this woman's description of Elisha as being a holy man of God, to say that he is truly set apart, that's to say something quite profound. Anyway, she says, let's make a small walled in upper room and put in it a bed, a table, a chair, a lamp there for him where he comes, or whenever he comes, he can stay there. Now, again, these kind of subtle nuances just escape us because if we're trained to simply read the Bible in English, then to us, a table, chair, and lamp, those are things that we have in several of the rooms of our house. We would think nothing of them other than just simple pieces of furniture. But that's not necessarily, I won't say it's never the case in Hebrew, but it's not always the case in Hebrew. Sometimes these things do indeed have significance. But just simply because we see the word table being used in one context and used in another, if it was used in a particular context where it has deep significance, doesn't mean it will in any other context, unless there are other things around it that support that. So we're going to need to build this. All right. Anyway, so this is a special chamber for Elisha. If we're going to draw the front of the woman's house, this being the door, windows, I know it's terrible, but that upper room is going to be built up here, right? So a four-walled chamber that's literally big enough to just simply put these four articles of furniture in. So here, though, when we see the use of the word table here in this particular verse, what we're to appreciate is this is indeed this very same word that is used way back in Exodus chapter 25 when they are told to construct a table of acacia wood that will be overlaid with gold, and that on the top of that table will be 12 loaves of bread, and on the Sabbath, those loaves will be replaced. That's important because it demonstrates a huge measure of significance with respect to its functionality in the space that it's actually arranged in. We'll talk about that here in a second. Then we go over to this word here, chair, but this is where we start to find deeper meaning here with respect to the significance of what's being said here. Because this word that's being said or translated chair here in 2 Kings chapter 4, as you see here on the screen, is the same Hebrew word, say, that's being used here in Genesis chapter 41, which this chapter has nothing to do with Elisha's story, but it's a place where we see this word being translated as something different than chair. Now, granted, a throne is a chair in the sense it's something a king sits upon, but it has deeper significance, right? Because there are other words that can be used for chair rather than just simply throne. So Pharaoh said to Joseph, only in the throne will I be greater than you. So here we have a table and a throne that's inside Elisha's room. Why is this important? Because if you're considering the idea that Elisha's room has in it a table and now a throne, and so does a particular boxed in room inside the tabernacle that has within it a table, and then an extending chamber on the backside separated by a curtain. And on the backside of that curtain is just a wooden box overlaid with gold with two cherubim on the top that serves as God's portable kiseh or throne, because that is where God is enthroned amongst his people, is right there between the cherubim. All right, let's move on a little further. So he's supposed to also have a lamp, but interestingly enough, that we go back to a bit Exodus chapter 25, and the exact same word here is being used in both contexts, and that is, as you can clearly see, menorah. So so you might think a small little clay pot, but perhaps what we're supposed to understand here is a more elaborate structure, as goes an actual 7-branched candlestick. I can't say that for sure, but what I can say is that we have yet again another piece of furniture arranged over here, and that being the lamp, here being the table, here being the chair or throne. Perhaps, and again, I'm just giving you the configuration that's in the tabernacle itself. But what about this bed here? Well, there's nothing significant about the word itself. It just simply means bed. But consider what happens on the bed, because the dead child is laid on the bed. And this is where Elisha, the prophet, is going to stretch himself out, and he's going to pray to the Lord on this bed and call out to the Lord to bring life back into this boy's lifeless carcass. What exactly is this altar here inside holy space supposed to do? Why is it different from the altar of burnt offering on the outside in the courtyard? Because this is the altar where incense is offered, which is supposed to represent the savoriness and the sweetness of the prayers that are offered up by God's people, as mediated through this network of priests, being arising as a sweet aroma unto the Lord up to the summit of his holy mountain, where his temple is, or where the extension of this earthly representation is actually supposed to be reaching up into, because on the other side of that curtain is where God's cosmic mountain is, as goes that ark. All that to say, what seems to be operative here in 2 Kings chapter 4 is something of a rudimentary construction of a small temple space. And so if that's the case, then who's the one actually living inside the space but Elisha? Because the most significant person inside the actual holy space of the tabernacle is, of course, God seated upon his throne. But on top of that, it's also the consecrated Adam figure who's supposed to be bearing out, as God's image bearer, the glory of God. So all that to say, what we have here in the larger context of Israel is, beginning with the time of Jeroboam, what's one of the biggest fears that he has, and that is that Israel will break away from him and they will ultimately put him to death, opting to go back and be loyal to the sons of David, because they will continue to go to Jerusalem and worship there at the Lord's temple. So he wants to cut them off from the temple and instead erects idols and shrines at Bethel and Dan for them to go and worship. And all of these kings since him have done the same thing. If they've done anything different, they've only made it exponentially worse in some form or another. And so the people of Israel, these 10 tribes, the majority of the land, is not going to Jerusalem to receive the life-giving blessings that come from the newly consecrated, newly erected Eden space, as the temple has replaced the tabernacle and is supposed to represent the Garden of Eden, where God and man come to meet together, and where God endows him with his wisdom, and then where man takes that wisdom and spreads it out to the other image bearers, ultimately bringing about the promise of Abraham, blessing the nations. Israel doesn't have that. The northern kingdom instead has false, perverted representations of that. So what do we have here? But perhaps something of a movement in which God is still keeping the ideal of temple alive, but he's doing it rather through a man and not so much an actual building. Maybe there's more to this. Let's explore this a little more. Notice that when we continue on in 2 Kings 4, when the boy has died, this Shunammite woman summons her husband and says, please send me one of the servants and one of the donkeys so I can hurry to the man of God and come back again. But he said, why are you going to him today? It's not a new moon or a Sabbath. Now, it's interesting that he would raise that up, because why would you say that unless this has been part of the woman's pattern before? that in some manner of dealing with Elisha, she has done so around these specific occasions. And if that's the case, what do we find in the words of Moses? But in Numbers 28, God tells the people through Moses that at the beginning of each of the months, which this particular word in Hebrew right here is supposed to represent the fact of the new moon. At the beginning of the new moon, you are to present a burnt offering to the Lord. This is the monthly burnt offering for all the months of the year. It becomes noted as the new moon feast during the time of Saul, when Saul is, of course, having Jonathan and David at his new moon festivals. And of course, at one of those feasts, he almost kills Jonathan because he was hoping to kill David instead, right? So anyway, this is a normative practice within Israel that's noted to be a part of the law and some of the holy days that they are to observe. And of course, the weekly observance of the Sabbath to go along with that, which of course, there are several passages in Leviticus and other places where specific rules are given for how they are to worship on the Sabbath. And where are those offerings given? But they are given at the tabernacle. You are to go and make offerings at the tabernacle on Sabbath. At least the priests are, but certainly for the new moon, people are supposed to come and do this as well. So this is sacred space. Israel is without sacred space. But this woman is taking these particular times of the week and month to go and seek out Elisha, not to make a clandestine, secretive pilgrimage to the temple in Jerusalem, but to go to God's man, Elisha. Now, what she gets from him there, does she bring him gifts to bless him? We don't know, but what we do know is that there seems to be a regular pattern of her seeking him out. Continuing on in this passage in 2 Kings 4, it ends the chapter with a man from Baal Shalishah coming to the man of God, Elisha, and he has a sack full of 20 loaves of barley bread from the first bread of the harvest. Now, this is interesting. Why is he doing this? You might think of it in the terms of some neighbor that you have known over the years that has a great big garden out behind their house, and they have everything from onions to watermelons, and they always have way too much for their own family, and they don't need it all, so they may sell some, but most of the time they have a tendency to just give it away. And why not, right? Because that's a great blessing for others to partake in. You might think of this story as that's what's going on here. This guy just has a whole awful lot of extra bread, and he's just bringing it for the people to have and enjoy. That's not even remotely close. Because notice here that this is very special because it's the first bread of the harvest. There are many passages to cite here. I'm only going to give you one. In Leviticus 23, they are told, number one, when you enter the land and you begin to harvest the grain or the various different crops that can be milled into flour to make bread, because there's barley, there's also grain or wheat, and then there's spelt. So different times, different harvests, and of course they can be used to make different bread products. All that to say, the first harvest of the natural produce of the land, you are to take and bring bread to present to the Lord as an offering unto him as part of the first fruits, if you will. But of course, this becomes a normative pattern for them because after after Passover, they are going to count off a certain amount of sabbatical weeks until they get to the end of 7. So after 7 weeks, 49 days, they add one more day to it. And that 50th day, they will celebrate ingathering, or what we would call Shavuot or Pentecost. So in Leviticus 29, or I'm sorry, chapter 23, verse 9, the Lord spoke to Moses and he said speak to the Israelites, when you enter the land I'm giving you and reap its harvest, bring the first sheaf of your harvest to the priest, and he will present the sheaf before the Lord so that you may be accepted. So if this is the first bread of the harvest, this guy is not supposed to be bringing it to Elisha or anybody else. This is God's bread. He's supposed to be taking it to the temple. But we live in Israel and he can't go to the temple. So why does he bring it to Elisha? I would think this guy is probably a person whose heart is entwined with the Lord's, and he is a servant of Yahweh. All that to simply say, if he can't get to the temple, it's not enough to just simply say the next best thing is Elisha. There's got to be something that he perceives about Elisha that would make this acceptable for him, because that's the whole point. You do this so that you become accepted. This is a measure of his sincerity as goes the worship he intends to give to Yahweh, but he is instead bringing it to a man who seemingly has taken the place of temple for these people who are in an exiled state and can't get to their temple. Let's finish this off. So that when Elisha comes to the boy who's dead, he lays himself down on him and puts his mouth to mouth, eye to eye, hand to hand, while he bent down over him, and then the boy's flesh became warm. Now, why is this important? Go back to Numbers 19. The person who touches any dead human corpse will be unclean for 7 days. And then on the 3rd day and the 7th day, they have to be sprinkled with this water that's made from the ashes of a red heifer that's been burnt. And then it's mixed with water, and it becomes the water of cleansing. And if they don't have this water sprinkled on them, they can't be cleansed. Then after this is all said and done, they get to come back in and become part of the assembly, because at this moment they've been defiled, tainted by death, even if it was necessary because of a family member that passed away, and this was the right and dignified thing to do in burying them, yet nonetheless, they are defiled. Elisha would know this. So why in the world does Elisha then presume to touch the dead carcass of this boy? Better yet, do we find anything written after this that says Elisha, knowing he was contaminated by death, then separated himself in quarantine for 7 days, and somebody brought him this water so that he could purify himself? Nothing is said of that regard. It's not to say that he is not paying attention to Torah, but this should remind us of another set of stories in the New Testament where several resurrections wind up happening. And of course, in many of these, Jesus winds up touching the dead carcass. He was in the close proximity of a dead carcass, which would ritualistically make him unclean and thereby subject to these rules. But what we have here is, instead of Jesus, who also touches lepers and women who are bleeding and are thereby ceremonially unclean and would cause others to be defiled through their own defilement, they do not defile him, but his purity in essence is what ultimately cleanses them, because he is God's incarnate temple, bringing not only the holiness of God, but the life-giving presence of God with him everywhere he goes. In other words, when we get to the New Testament and we find that Jesus is doing these things, in some ways it seems startling. And we, of course, read other commentators mentioning these kinds of things in New Testament texts, or I should say based on these New Testament texts, that this is something that makes Jesus very different from other rabbis and sages of his time, or that were predecessors of his. And that is true in large part, but it's not a wholly foreign, and I mean WHOLEY. I think it's, forgive me. Not wholly different from what we've already seen patterned in the Old Testament, because here we have Elisha, who, if you've been understanding what I've said, in the sense that he is the near kinsman redeemer to these people, is acting as Jesus is, even though he bears no kinship with any of these people, yet acting in this way to help redeem them from the oppressiveness that they have found themselves under, is in every way setting the stage for Jesus's action as the near kinsman redeemer for all humanity, in the vein of Luke 4. And that now Elisha here is presented in some way as being the person whom gets to occupy sacred space and something of a temple-like setting in which others are honoring and venerating him as if he were a priest operating inside the sacred space of the temple, and bringing him offerings or making visitations to him at certain festive times of the year where they're supposed to gather at the tabernacle, new moon, Sabbath, and so forth. And that this is where people are coming to receive the blessings of the Lord as they offer up burnt offerings and grain offerings and fellowship offerings, and of course, thanksgiving and vow offerings. And with that, expressing thanks to God for his faithfulness in bringing the rain and making the crops grow and all that stuff. What they assume to get from the temple but can't because they're cut off from it, they come to Elisha to get. And we see in the case of this boy here, he clearly gives God's life-giving presence, the Eden blessing, to this boy in bringing him back to life. And of course, overcoming his mother's anguish. And so much can be said in the way of how this sets us up for Jesus's ministry and how he will become the life-giving temple presence of the Lord, incarnated in human flesh. It perhaps then should be no coincidence or surprise to us that we find that many times, way more than Elijah is, Elisha is referenced as the man of God. It's as if we hear someone saying, God man. Don't twist this as if I'm saying he's God incarnated in human flesh. Obviously not. That's Jesus and Jesus alone. But what I simply mean to illustrate is that this sets us up for Jesus's ministry in many ways, and he is going to take this and exponentially multiply it and do greater things that Elisha could never do. And Elisha is only doing this because of God's operative power working through him, right? So we understand then that if that's the case, Elisha is the successor to Elijah, as Jesus is the successor to John. But in many ways, Elijah is like a Jesus, and therefore Elisha is somewhat like the disciples of Jesus who carry on his ministry. And that's where we come. That ours is the ministry also of reconciliation that Paul talks about in 2 Corinthians 5. And beyond that, we are a temple. We are a royal nation, a kingdom of priests. Our job is to intercede and mediate between God and man and to bring Eden blessing, life-giving blessing to people by sharing the gospel, by being life amidst their death, because we carry life with us. We carry life with us, and it stinks to some, as Paul was talking about in his letter to the churches in Corinth, but also it's the sweet savor of life to those who life has been imparted to them because they have become disciples of Christ, largely through the efforts of us and others, right? So it's important for us to remember this is our reason for drawing breath daily, and we cannot slack up on this mission because it's the only mission that we have. It's the one thing that Jesus left us with, friends. So we need to be busy about that. Jesus, we are so grateful again for all of your wonderful blessings and allowing us to have this time. Please press the meaning of these words upon our heart with deeper fervency and sincerity. In your name we pray. Amen.